A brief note before this episode begins. We, and I'm sure all of you listening, are holding feelings of anger and frustration and sadness as we pray for peace in Israel and Gaza and for the healing of our world. We release this episode while holding pain in our hearts, and if now is not the time to listen to something that will feel separated from the tragedy of our moment right now, just save this episode for a later date. You can come back to it. If now would be precisely the moment to take a second and consider the future of our Jewish community, in a conversation that does not tie directly to Israel-Palestine, we invite you to listen in.
This is a special bonus episode of Judaism Unbound, Jewish feminist comedy. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we are doing a special bonus episode because, in most cases, our Anyeshiva classes are taught by people who have been our favorite guests on Judaism Unbound before. But what are we supposed to do when there's a person who we know would have been one of our favorite guests, but simply has not yet been a guest on the podcast? And the answer is to record a bonus episode of the podcast so that we can stay true to our vision of the Anyeshiva as that place where the greatest podcasts go to teach you. So our guest today is Jonathan Branfman, who is teaching a class called Rude, Lewd, and Fabulous, 21st Century Jewish Feminist Comedy, from Haddish, that's Tiffany Haddish, to Glazer, that's Ilana Glazer, to Bloom, that's Rachel Bloom. Just a little bit more information about this class. The class is going to analyze how lighthearted humor can convey serious critiques about social ills like racism and misogyny. It will also examine how these stars use humor to joyfully envision a kinder, more inclusive future. Our guest today, Jonathan Branfman, the teacher of this class, is the Eli Reinhard Postdoctoral Fellow in Jewish Studies at Stanford University, where he researches and teaches about Jewish identity in American popular culture, focusing on the ways that Jewish stars perform race, gender, and sexuality. Jonathan Branfman's first academic book is forthcoming in 2024, entitled Millennial Jewish Stars: Navigating Racial Anti-Semitism, Masculinity, and White Supremacy. We're super excited about this class. We know that you will be too. So if you are excited at any point in today's conversation, just pause this episode and head over to judaismunbound.com/classes. Sign up for this class. Again, it is called Rude, Lewd, and Fabulous. And then unpause the episode and come right back and listen to the rest of the conversation.
Dan, I'm interrupting. I have a question. Is there financial aid available?
Lex, thank you so much for your interruption. There's financial aid available for this class and every class. So if you just go to the page of the class where you sign up, you will find just above the place where it says sliding scale prices, there is a link that you can click on to go to the financial aid form. And if you submit that, you will in short order receive a response and you'll be able to sign up at whatever price you can afford. Without further ado, Jonathan Branfman, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So a podcast that I really love about the Bible recently had an episode where the guest was claiming that chapter 7 of the book of Daniel was the most important chapter of the Bible in the whole Bible. And it made me think to ask you, what is the most important Jewish feminist comedy of all time and why?
That is a very big question. I will say a very influential piece of feminist comedy is Barbra Streisand's film Funny Girl, as one of the films in which Barbra established herself in American popular culture as a figure of delightful excess, a figure who overflows the boundaries of conventional femininity, asserting herself in ways that were often considered, quote, inappropriate for dainty or ladylike women, and yet created great mass appeal through that performance. And although Barbra Streisand was neither the first nor the last exuberant Jewish woman comedian.
Thank goodness.
Thank goodness, right? Because there's such a rich history that she was already drawing on. For instance, she was playing the earlier Jewish performer Fanny Brice, and later performers certainly have riffed on Streisand's image. But in contemporary American popular culture, even for those who haven't seen Funny Girl, that is a significant film that I would encourage you to see.
Is there a lineage, let's say, of Jewish feminist comedy? Like, where would we start to think about where this all begins, how it flows? I mean, I know this is the whole topic of the whole class, but as we look in a kind of 40,000-foot view, what should we be looking at when we think about the story of Jewish feminist comedy?
So there is a long lineage of Jewish American women comedians, and specifically comedians pushing the boundaries of, quote, respectable femininity to assert their voices or their desires in ways that were typically reserved for men. There's a term from the scholar Sarah Blacher-Cohen, the term unkosher comedians. So that's one way of describing this lineage. And we could certainly trace it back to the late 1800s. Just a few that we could look at in the early 20th century would include Fanny Brice and Sophie Tucker. Moving up through the mid-20th century, we could look at Joan Rivers, Barbara Streisand. Moving towards the late 20th century, Fran Drescher, Sarah Silverman, and then in the 21st century, as inheritors of that tradition, folks that we'll look at in this class, like Ilana Glazer, Abby Jacobson, Rachel Bloom, Lena Dunham, Amy Schumer, and Tiffany Haddish.
A who's who, a big list. I'm into it. I want to get a sense. Okay, so this class is going to talk about some of those people. Great.
Yes.
What is this class? I think for a lot of people, they are receiving emails from us right now saying, hey, there are many courses being offered, 3-week amazing opportunities. Some of them have words like Kabbalah in them or references to characters in the Talmud like a demon, things that tie to elements of Jewish tradition we might expect to find in a thing with yeshiva in the title, a Jewish study place. What is this class and why does it matter, even if it might not be what people are expecting to find in a space like ours?
I often find that Jewish folks who may be well informed about Jewish theology and religion and certain cultural practices like the holidays know very little about Jewish history, and specifically about the historical lineage of stigmas on Jewish bodies, like the notion that Jewish bodies perform gender in certain strange ways, alongside the better known stereotypes of like big noses or curly hair. So one thing we're looking at in this course is how contemporary Jewish stars in the 21st century inherit an 8th century lineage of popular assumptions about Jewish bodies, assumptions that have developed over the centuries through art, literature, theology, theater, racial pseudoscience, and assumptions that still permeate American popular, quote, common sense, even for folks who have no idea about that longer history. And then how stars like Ilana Glazer take hold of all that stigma and use it in some kind of creative new way. So for instance, as we'll learn in the class, there's a long lineage of negative assumptions about Jewish women's femininity, depicting Jewish women as dirty seductresses, in some cases depicting them as masculinized and ugly and repulsive. And those were stigmas that historically served to police Jewish women. But we will see how stars like Amy Schumer or Ilana Glazer take hold of all that material and do something creative and beautiful with it to assert their own voices as Jewish women, and also to say, like, who cares about being dainty and beautiful anyway? We will refuse to censor our voices in the ways that, quote, ladylike women are supposed to. We're learning a very long but little known history of popular assumptions about Jewish bodies, and then seeing how those assumptions play out today when young Jewish stars take hold of them and use them in creative ways.
So this is a space, Judaism Unbound, where very, very regularly, I especially, but I think both Dan and I, when people say things about what Judaism is and how Judaism stands for X, Y, or Z, we tend to be ready to say Judaism doesn't have, it's not one thing that has sort of wandered its way through history unchanged. It's constantly different in different contexts. I say that because we're talking about Jewish comedy or Jewish feminist comedy here. And I think an easy question or pushback people could give that I'm kind of offering is, okay, I happen to be a person who loves shows that star Ilana Glazer and Rachel Bloom. And though I haven't spent quite as many hours watching Tiffany Haddish, I also have spent many, including watching her awesome, amazing bat mitzvah videos that she did. She did an adult bat mitzvah. So I love all of these people. I'm not asking like, well, why are you saying there's a thing called Jewish feminist comedy to say that what they're doing isn't important? But like, in what ways are these folks actually doing something that could be or should be grouped in a way that we call Jewish comedy, as opposed to like Jews doing cool feminist comedy?
Great question. In many cases, these performers are simultaneously drawing on popular assumptions about Jewish bodies and drawing on Jewish religious norms or texts or rituals to break the boundaries of conventional femininity. So a great example would be the episode of Broad City in which Abby and Alana are going to Alana's grandmother's Shiva. The name of the grandmother is Grandma Esther, certainly a very well-known Jewish name, and perhaps specifically referencing Queen Esther in the Bible. And importantly, this is also the episode in which Abby straps on a dildo to penetrate her male neighbor. On one hand, Abby is performing a sexual act that many Americans would consider transgressive or maybe even view as disgusting. But the episode repackages that transgression as beautiful and fun, partially through the interplay of the storylines about sex and about the Shiva. So, for instance, Alana says to Abby, you can't pass up this opportunity. You got to go for it because you got to be like Grandma Esther, who seized every opportunity in life and really lived it up. Later on, when Abby gets to the Shiva, she says, I did this sex act for Grandma Esther in her memory. And so this interweaving takes an act that many people might view as some newfangled, strange, hyper-modern, transgressive break with tradition. And instead, for Abby and Alana, it's this form of tribute to the women who have come before them, including the character of Esther, who in certain ways uses her sexuality to break boundaries and enter spaces where women would not, or certainly Jewish women, would not typically be allowed. So that is just one example of how in Broad City, the interplay of Jewish cultural texts, tropes, characters, and rituals with present-day secular cultural transgressions serves to celebrate...
Secular?
I'll stick with secular, but people can hear however they want to say it. This interplay of the old and the new, the profane and the holy, the secular and the Jewish, serves to elevate young Jewish women as glamorous icons when they break the boundaries of restrictive femininity, rather than stigmatizing them as, quote, dirty or perverse or unnatural.
One way to think about Lex's question from before is, why can current comedy be important? Why should we see it as actual Judaism, as actually Jewish material, if perhaps Jewish text, but maybe not necessarily going quite as far as that? But it makes me think about whether Jewish text started out as popular culture in many cases. And I suppose that I worry that sometimes we have a tendency in Jewish life to not care for babies, is a way that I've put it, to say that things that are not yet grown up, things that have not yet reached their adult status, their status that they may reach one day, are not important because we can't see the potential in them now.
And just to clarify what you mean, you're getting at the ways in which, new forms of pop culture could be the next Esther, could be the next book of Esther. At one point they were babies.
Yeah, or is it not that we should even be thinking about that, and it's really just important to enjoy it as it is?
I hear part of your question is about the historical development of scriptures and how they became canonized and elevated as sacred texts, if some of these texts originated in more popular forms. That is a great question that a historian of scripture would be a great person to answer. I can certainly say that when it comes to the story of Esther, there is a history of what we might call carnivalesque play, such as cross-dressing within Purim ceremonies, that goes back far beyond contemporary notions of queerness or drag, and now serves as an inspiration to present-day queer folks. As you may know, there's an increasing trend within Jewish queer communities, or even beyond, to celebrate Purim with drag shows. But I think I can answer more deeply your question about the value of contemporary pop culture texts like the TV show Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, that people might dismiss as frivolous or unintellectual, but I would argue that those folks haven't really watched the show carefully. All of these shows, or many shows by millennial Jewish women, are very thoughtfully recombining older texts and symbols, such as the Queen Esther story, but also including references to Holocaust trauma, immigration trauma, use of Yiddish. There's a very interesting scene in one episode of Crazy Ex-Girlfriend where the lead character sort of is in a flashback to the immigration era and the dialogue is in Yiddish, which is a language that I think most millennial viewers didn't grow up expecting they would ever see a secular Jewish performer their age speak. And so, although it's maybe too early to say how these texts will age over the next 50 years or 100 years, I view them as powerful commentaries on how millennial Jewish women today are experiencing their Jewish identity, including cultural identity, ethnic identity, religious identity, and the blurry boundaries between those things. I would view a text like Broad City not necessarily as as like an essay on the history of Jewish assimilation, but instead as a snapshot of how multiple experiences of Jewish religiosity, ethnicity, and culture are experienced in this moment. To think of it almost as like in the same way that a clay vase from a certain time period gives you all sorts of snapshots about what was going on in the society at this time. I think that's what Broad City and Crazy Ex-Girlfriend and Tiffany Haddish's Black Mitzvah special offer.
Every once in a while, people ask me, Lex, who, like, of anybody on the planet do you most want to have as a guest on Judaism Unbound? The answer I've given most frequently is, in fact, Rachel Bloom. So Rachel Bloom, if you're out there listening, I promise this is not from like some creepy crush place. Like, I truly just think that everything Jonathan Branfman just said about what Crazy Ex-Girlfriend does Jewishly, I think it is one of the most incredibly interesting contributions to, whether we call it Jewish culture, Judaism, whatever term we want to like Jewish stuff happening in my lifetime. I really think that. And what I love about it is Davka, is specifically the fact that it doesn't think of itself as being like Torah or being a Jewish text. I think that is why I find it so powerful. It's not constrained by the boundaries of the genre that is texts people use for Jewish meaning making. When people like set out to write a text that is going to move people through Jewish mechanisms, like there are certain subconscious rules they follow and ways that they tell stories. And I think Crazy Ex-Girlfriend doesn't follow those rules, but yet it has a song about Holocaust trauma. Yiddish popping up here. It has, Jewish mother stereotypes playing in really interesting ways and being pushed upon in really interesting ways. You have the ongoing lineage, not just of Jewish feminist comedy, but of Jewish anxiety tropes in popular culture that we could talk about for hours and hours with like Woody Allen, but being consciously, I think, played with by a Rachel Bloom. And then you've got this whole other show she did called Reboot that I actually think is as interesting. I'm not going to go into that because I know fewer people have watched it. But all that is to say, of all people on the planet, my dream guests, and I say Rachel Bloom, I also say Daveed Diggs, who is not necessarily part of this conversation, but is another figure in pop culture. And occasionally I say Bernie Sanders. I want it to be clear that I'm not just saying the ones relevant to this episode. But like, I genuinely believe that these are people who are part of 21st century Judaism. They're not just Jewish culture. So often in Jewish institutional life, there's this tendency to see pop culture as like a gateway drug to Jewish stuff. Like, let's get people to participate in Jewish events because we show a screening of a TV show they like, and then we'll have the email list for them to sign up for where we'll tell them to come to Shabbat services. And it sends the message that Jewish pop culture is step one, but the real thing is what you get to after that. I'm curious how you would articulate your understanding of like what work Jewish feminist comedy or Jewish pop culture generally does for Jews and for the world. Like I had a thread with you. I'm going to break the fourth wall. I said that when we were proposing titles for the class, like, what if we called it Jewish feminist comedy as Torah? And you were like, I don't quite want to do that. I'm kind of curious why you don't quite want to do that, but I'm also curious to the extent you might see what I'm getting at with that terminology, how you describe what Jewish feminist comedy does for contemporary Jews in the world.
Sure. I see Jewish feminist comedy as capturing Jewish lived experience, at least for a certain demographic of Jews, such as secular, often white presenting, often Ashkenazi, often East Coast Jews, and crystallizing the experience of race, gender, and sexuality that many of those Jews experience on a daily basis in a way that few of us have ever seen on screen before, and few of us grow up with the tools to articulate. For example, one thing we'll discuss in the class is how on Broad City, Abby and Alana, but particularly Alana, they sort of float in and out of whiteness. They call themselves white, but then in some ways are not always perceived exactly as white, but nor are they perceived as people of color. And this experience is so difficult to articulate both on the show and beyond because our society tends to think of race in a simple binary between white people and people of color, when in fact, what I think many Euro-American Jews experience is the sense that like something feels familiar about this sense of being in an unstable and unarticulable position that is somehow not quite fully within whiteness, but also definitely not within person of colorness. What is the history of this ambiguous Jewish racialization? How did it come to be historically? And watching Broad City can provide a starting point for naming that sensation, which so many of us have experienced, and then gaining better tools for understanding how did this lived experience come to be, and how can we speak about it in an accurate way that seriously accounts for white privilege and seriously accounts for racial anti-Semitism or other forms of bodily stigma that go beyond whiteness. And how do we account for that complexity all at once, both on screen and in daily life, rather than falling into the traps that we've probably all heard folks fall into, such as folks claiming either that they can't have white privilege because they're Jewish, or conversely claiming that anti-Semitism can't matter because, quote, Jews are white. Oversimplifications that we've all particularly seen recently, but those oversimplifications have been going on for years. And watching Broad City can be a very powerful starting place for understanding why those oversimplifications aren't enough and gaining better skills to speak with clarity about Jewish racialization in the US.
So I'd imagine that there's a reason other than just focus that you are teaching this class about Jewish feminist comedy as opposed to just modern Jewish comedy or something like that. Could you talk a little bit about why you're particularly interested in Jewish feminist comedy and what you think that these Jewish women comedians are trying to do that perhaps Jerry Seinfeld or, things of that nature were not doing?
Sure. So I do write and teach about Jewish millennial stars of all genders, and in fact, of other generations as well. But I think for a brief class like this, with only 3 sessions, where you want to convey a cohort who share certain common themes, but also have exciting differences, I think focusing on millennial Jewish women, even though Rachel Bloom and Tiffany Haddish have very different lived experiences and different performance styles, partially as a result of their experiences as a white Jewish woman and a Black Jewish woman, they do share certain themes of transgressive humor about bodies, including what might be called, quote, potty humor when boys do it, but is generally considered off limits for women, and how they use this body humor, not just to shock, but actually to push the boundaries of women's bodily autonomy in public and to assert women's right to have bodies that are just as complex and uncensored as men's bodies are often allowed to be. So another way of thinking about this is if Seth Rogen is allowed to make fart jokes and much edgier jokes beyond that and be seen as not just funny, but lovable and adorable and cute by many fans in a sort of like boyish way, why can't women do the same and uncensor their bodies in the same way? And again, not just be seen as funny, but still be seen as beautiful or admirable, making space for women to reconcile unrestrained bodies with admirable ideas and admirable personalities in a way that is typically available to men, but not to women. So that would be one type of through line that we see throughout the millennial Jewish women in this course.
So I go to different Jewish communities sometimes, and I'm giving guest spiels about various things. Some of them, funny enough, are about pop culture. And I also go as a person who like leads services on a Friday night or whatever. And I'm always interested in the ways in which those experiences feel the same as one another and the ways in which those experiences feel different from one another. I find them to be more similar than I do different a lot of the times, which is why I push to use language like Torah to describe things most people call pop culture. But I do recognize there's differences. But what I certainly see as something that's important to name is if I'm going to a new Jewish space and I want to connect to people in that room over Kiddush, over wine and snacks and whatever, and I'm small talking with people, how much Torah I know, how much I know about classical Jewish texts, I have found to endear me less quickly and less fully to your typical synagogue going, like person who is like at a synagogue or in a Jewish community center. Like me being able to share a love for like a Jewish text from the Bible or the Talmud endears me to a smaller percentage of people than me being able to connect to their favorite movie or their favorite TV show. Me being able to like show that I care about those things, I actually think is a rabbinic skill. I don't think it is just, oh, cool, if you're able to do that. I think we should be building a context where we are able to, as Jewish trained leaders, have a familiarity with some of those things so that when we are in different communities, we have the tools to connect with somebody whose biggest love in the world is Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, or is Prince of Egypt, or is Rugrats Hanukkah, or is Puppy for Hanukkah, the music video with Daveed Diggs. Like those are not trivial things. And so I guess I'm wondering if you have like a charge for us. You might not. A lot of scholars, they don't want to give shoulds. I'm asking a little bit for a should. Is there a gap? What would be better, or would it be better if we actually made it more normal for people to learn about Jewish comedy, Jewish feminist comedy, Jewish pop culture, stars in contexts of Jewish community?
I'm definitely in favor of education about Jewish popular culture within, say, Hebrew school settings. I know some Hebrew schools that do include courses like that for their older students. Those courses become most valuable when we use them as windows into wider social issues that congregants are experiencing. Like a moment ago, when we talked about Broad City as a window into questions of Jewish racial status and a window to assist audiences in articulating their own experience with greater historical insight and greater care. Similarly, a show like Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, it can be valuable to explore the history of mental health stigmas specifically on Jews and the historical notion that Jews, particularly Jewish men, were stereotyped as being more susceptible to mental illness. And we could consider how the show plays on those notions of neurosis, but also recasts them in a new way by centering women's experiences and essentially transforms Jewish humor into a platform for better conversations about mental health in general, and as well as conversations about addiction and all sorts of topics that we might not initially expect to find in a show that bills itself as a, quote, dark romantic comedy musical. So yes, I would like to see more education about contemporary Jewish pop culture in Jewish institutional settings. I would also like to see that education historicized. In the same way that we could ask, why do some people have an orange on the Seder plate? And where did that come from? And what does that tell us? We could ask, why does Rachel Bloom on Crazy Ex-Girlfriend have such a fraught relationship with her mother? And when did this stereotype of the, quote, bad or aggressive Jewish mother come into being? And what can we learn about our own history and experience by not taking these stereotypes as facts and not just being like, oh, ha, 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 that is a stereotype, but instead being like, when and how did a whole country, including a lot of people who may never have met a Jew, decide that this is what Jewish mothers are, and what social forces contributed to that process, and how are those forces shaping our lives off screen? So that's the type of study I would like to see.
That's an amazing note to end on. Thank you so much, Jonathan Branfman, for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you.
And so if you want to kickstart that process of learning that Jonathan Branfman just talked about, diving into pop culture, not just sort of from that ha-ha place, but from a vantage point where it's combined and intersected with conversations about broader social issues, this is the class you got to take. Dan said pause your audio and go to judaismunbound.com/classes before. I'm going to say do it again. Did you? I paused this. Okay, you're good. You're on the page. You're in the process of registering. We love it. Thank you for listening to this episode. And as a reminder, there are other mini courses being offered in the Anya Shiva right now. So you can sign up for this one and 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 more. There's 5 total options that begin just after Thanksgiving. So super soon. Do not delay in signing up. We mentioned that there's financial aid available. That form is really easy to access on the pages of any of these mini courses. So we really hope that we will see you in these classes. If you have any questions, please just reach out at Unyeshiva, UNYESHIVA, at JudaismUnbound.com. That'll get to our full staff and we'll be able to respond really quickly. And we really want to hear from you, course ideas that you think would be awesome to have in the future. But thanks so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.